This entire house is built out of wood. I mean, we really do have wood on the floor, wood on the walls, wood on the ceiling. Can't really get away from building a house like this without using a large number of wood products in the home.
Steve Martinez owns a construction business in Boise, Idaho. He says volatile lumber prices have been causing uncertainty for his business.
So it's definitely a concern. One bunk of this material, going up tenfold can cause a huge disruption from a price perspective.
In April 2025, the price of softwood lumber was 23% higher than the previous year. Lumber futures in the first quarter of 2025 have also surged on fears of higher duties as well as sawmill closures across North America. That has impacted some of the U.S. biggest home builders like Lennar, Horton and Toll Brothers, all of which suffered declines in their stocks during the spring. But while lumber escaped the latest round of tariffs, they are on the radar of the Trump administration. Canada accounts for about 85% of all U.S. softwood lumber imports and represents almost a quarter of U.S. supply.
We're going to build our future with American hands, with American heart, American steel, and we're going to build it with American pride like we used to.
In March, the White House issued an executive order telling the Commerce Department to enhance domestic production and investigate the national security impact of imports of lumber and timber. The White House claims wood products, including lumber, are a critical manufacturing industry essential to national security.
Lumber has always been the poster boy of tariffs. I think there's a little misconception because there is already a lumber tariff in place for the Canadian side. And so these new tariffs that were being proposed would be in addition to an already existing tariff.
Countervailing and anti-dumping duties on Canadian lumber have been in place for decades. The current rate of 14.5% could more than double to 34.5% later this year, following a review by the Commerce Department.
While the administration claims that they're going to increase domestic lumber production, that would take a very long time. Right now, you can't immediately scale up domestic lumber production in the U.S. in order to meet the demand.
That uncertainty is another factor impacting home ownership levels in the U.S., where 2/3 of Americans say they are priced out of the market. Over 100 million American households are unable to afford a median-priced home, which now sits at $460,000.
The only way we're going to solve the affordability crisis is to build more homes.
So will higher duties on lumber and tariffs on home construction products further discourage new development and exacerbate housing affordability issues? Tradewinds General Contracting, which got its start in 1980, specializes in high-end multifamily homes and apartments. Tradewinds makes about 10 to 15 homes a year.
Now is the time that you can see behind the walls, which is really nice. Once a house is drywalled and covered up, you don't really get to see what goes into the home.
But uncertainty over the cost of building materials has added to a new layer of complexity to the business.
This is OSB, and part of the concern that we have about it is that it is literally used on the entire house. It's the whole roof, it's all of the walls, it's all of the floor.
The average new single-family home uses more than 2,200 square feet of softwood lumber and 15,000 board feet of framing lumber. The wooden frame is often the most expensive part of the build, making up about 15 to 18% of total construction costs. Softwood lumber is also used in cabinets, windows, and doors.
Our contracts are all fixed price, meaning that from the time we bid a project to the time we start to the time we order the materials, the prices could change drastically. But we are trying to pre-order as much material as we can. The hard part is where do you put that material? We're a small business. We don't have a bunch of ground just where we're able to stockpile lumber or drywall.
Another issue is where he sources his material. 1/3 of lumber used in U.S. home building comes from Canada.
The majority of our lumber comes from Canada.
The kind of lumber we produce, spruce pine fir lumber. It's preferred by builders in terms of its ability for nailing, its lightweight, and so forth.
That means higher prices, not just for new builds, but for renovations, fencing, garages, and interiors too. The trade war with China could also boost the cost for home builders on other items.
A lot of supplies for housing come from China. That is appliances, plumbing materials, vinyl flooring, all sorts of components that go into the construction and the remodeling of a home come from China and other parts of Asia. These tariffs are only going to increase costs for builders when builder costs were already rising.
When you look in a home, you could throw a dart and hit just about anything that's impacted by the tariff discussion. There's thousands of products, from glass in the windows to vinyl or fiberglass or wood that frames those objects. When those prices go up, business slows down. There's never a silver bullet to fix this. It's usually a death by 1,000 cuts, and this is just one more thing that's kind of going in the headwind of keeping homes affordable.
The U.S. has more than 765 million acres of planted and natural forest land and an additional 58 million acres of woodlands. American softwood lumber production increased to 64 million cubic meters in 2023, up nearly 1% from the year prior. Softwood trees like the western red cedar grow faster than hardwood trees and are cheaper to produce and easier to cut. Despite that, the country faces a shortage of lumber. The top countries the U.S. imports forest products from are Canada, China, Brazil, and Mexico. The pandemic caused softwood lumber prices to soar more than 300% due to constraints on supply and demand for lumber as real estate and home improvements boomed. Regulations have also been blamed for the slow domestic production of lumber. The Endangered Species Act, or ESA, of 1973, and National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, of 1970, both impact lumber production according to critics. The Endangered Species Act protects at-risk plants and animals. The National Environmental Policy Act requires federal agencies to assess their environmental impact on future projects. Trump hopes to streamline these processes through his executive orders.
We have got to reopen our national forests to allow for more harvest and milling of America's own timber. When we talk about lumber production, we have to continue to build capacity both in the American Southeast, where we have southern yellow pine trees, and then also in the Pacific Northwest, where we have spruce pine fir. Those are the two dominant building materials when it comes to lumber in this country.
The U.S. has more than 3,000 businesses in the sawmilling and wood production industry, including about 500 lumber manufacturing facilities.
But the mills in those areas have largely been shuttered because domestic production has been down, because home production has been down over the last couple of years. It's going to take a while to reopen those mills that are mothballed. It's going to take years and a lot of investment, millions of dollars in investment to start up new mills.
Even if you were to ramp up and build new mills over the course of a couple of years, you also need the labor to go out and take down the timber, to transport that timber to the mills, and then get that timber out to builders. That infrastructure, that labor simply doesn't exist right now, and it's going to be very difficult to fill quickly.
To beef up its lumber supply, the U.S. has relied on Canada, but their relationship is tense, with both countries having a long-standing dispute over softwood lumber. The U.S. says that Canadian subsidies and pricing practices have harmed the domestic lumber industry. In response, the U.S. has applied countervailing duties and anti-dumping laws on our northern neighbors since the 1980s. Countervailing duties are imposed when foreign subsidies negatively affect U.S. industries. Anti-dumping laws apply when imported goods are sold below the cost of production or below domestic market prices. Experts suggest it could take at least 5 years for the U.S. to produce enough to match Canadian lumber imports. A final determination of whether Canadian lumber tariffs will be raised could come in August. These duties, along with rising demand and insufficient domestic production, have led to price volatility for builders.
Homes in America are built by small businessmen and women. In fact, they're the ones who are going to feel the pinch the most. I share the president's desire to have every stick of lumber, every hinge, every light fixture made here in America. The reality is the regulatory environment, the high labor costs. We have to ask ourselves, what are the reasons why we don't produce enough in this country?
Even though there's been some tariffs excluded and some not, we have to prep and plan as though they're already in place. We're building it into our pricing model already.
Beyond just materials, the lumber industry is also facing a labor crisis.
We are needing more people. We have more people leaving the industry through retirement or job change than we do have entering this market. We also are looking at immigration as though it's the bottom of the barrel from a job perspective.
Jobs in woodworking and logging are on the decline, with employment expected to dip 2% and 4% by 2033. The industry continues to struggle in attracting younger workers to replace its aging workforce.
The one thing about the sawmilling business, whether it's the US or Canada, trying to find workers, skilled workers in particular, is very difficult.
Recruitment is tough, and the labor pool is tightening further with stricter immigration policies.
Certainly immigrants tend to take the jobs that nobody else wants that are living there. They have what's called a green chain, where all the lumber comes off on a long chain and people pull it off the green chain, kind of back-breaking work all day long and usually outdoors and the elements. So that's typically immigrant type work. Some more immigrants might be involved in things like logging, because that's again a more dangerous job, dirty job.
Immigration concerns and fears of deportation are making it harder to retain this workforce.
There's a fear factor out there, whether it's real or not.
Another trend impacting the industry is lumber operations moving to the south, attracted by lower labor and energy costs, fewer regulations, and a calmer climate. Nearly 38% of America's lumber production is produced in the south. Canadian and U.S. builders are shifting operations and investing in the region due to less strict state regulations and cheaper costs.
The Canadian companies that have already invested heavily in the U.S. South, which they did that because there was no timber left in British Columbia, and that strategy looks a little more brilliant.
Despite that, domestic production of lumber continues to fall short of demand, keeping prices high and supply strained.
We need to lower the regulatory burden on housing at all three levels of government. And we need to build more housing, and that's the way we're gonna increase housing affordability across the board for everybody who wants to own a home or an apartment.
When we build a home, you're marking that up to a certain degree, but if your price point gets to a point where less people are buying, it doesn't matter how much more money you're making off of these tariffs. If the demand slows down, that's definitely a concern.